Today we're looking at the science of forest mensuration, which is basically just measuring trees, right?
But not with a simple tape measure. We are talking about highly strategic predictive modeling.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this because I want you, the listener, to picture standing in a massive ancient forest. To the naked eye, it feels totally static, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It feels frozen in time.
But underneath that quiet surface, it is actively running complex math. We're pulling all this today from a specialized document called Increment in Forestry, and we're looking at this concept called, well, increment.
Right, an increment is basically the absolute baseline of all forest productivity. It isn't just a generic word for a tree getting bigger.
It's more precise than that.
Much more. It's the exact quantifiable measure of how much a tree, or like an entire stand of trees, increases in size over a very specific period of time.
So it's the foundational data point.
Exactly. I mean, if you want to manage a forest, or preserve an ecosystem, or predict a timber yield, you just cannot do anything without first understanding the increment.
But before we can get into the timeline and figure out how fast this growth is happening, we have to establish what we're actually measuring.
Right, the physical dimensions.
Yeah, because obviously anyone who has ever seen a tree knows it grows taller and wider, height and diameter.
Sure.
But knowing a pine tree grew like 2 inches thicker doesn't really give a forester what they need for complex ecosystem management, does it?
No, not at all. Height and diameter are just raw, one-dimensional data points. The real insight comes from specialized metrics.
Okay, so what are they actually looking for?
Well, when foresters are out in the field, they're looking closely at 3 major dimensions of increment: basal area, volume, and biomass.
Let's break those down because basal area always trips me up a bit.
It can be tricky, yeah.
If you chop a tree down and look at the stump, that flat surface is the basal area.
Right.
It's the cross-section of the stem. But why do we care about that specific flat area?
Because it operates as a proxy for density. Imagine you're managing 100 acres of woodland. You don't necessarily need to know how fat every individual trunk is.
That would take forever.
Exactly. But you do need to know how much physical space the timber is occupying collectively.
Okay.
When you sum up the basal area of every tree in a given hectare, you get a highly accurate picture of crowd density. It tells you exactly how fiercely those trees are competing for soil nutrients, water, and canopy space.
Oh, I get it. It's like calculating the floor space taken up by people in a crowded room rather than just measuring how wide everyone's shoulders are.
Yes.
It tells you when the room is basically at capacity.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Oh.
And once you understand the density, you move on to the actual output of the tree, which brings us to volume and biomass.
Right, the big ones.
Yeah, these are the 2 metrics that really dictate global forestry decisions.
And the distinction between them is crucial, depending on who's doing the math, right?
Oh, completely.
Like if I'm a commercial builder and I'm looking for timber to frame a housing development, I only really care about volume. I want to know the increase in the amount of actual usable wood in that central trunk.
Right, because you're dealing in board feet of lumber. You can't build a house out of leaves and twigs.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're an ecologist or like a climate scientist tracking how much of a forest is biologically active, volume is totally inadequate. You need biomass.
Because biomass measures the increase in total organic matter.
Yes. It includes the trunk, sure, but also the branches, the root systems, the foliage, everything.
So a tree is doing all of these things simultaneously. It's pushing taller, expanding its cross-section, packing on dense wood, and growing a massive root system.
All at once, yeah.
But the scientist essentially has to choose their lens based on their specific goal.
The purpose of the measurement dictates the metric, always. And once you lock in your metric, let's say we're tracking volume for a timber harvest, you run into a massive complication.
Which is?
Trees do not grow at a flat, consistent rate. They don't just add exactly 2 cubic feet of wood every single year like a machine.
Well, yeah, because a tiny sapling doesn't behave like a 150-year-old oak tree.
Exactly.
And this is where the timelines come in. So how do we actually track that nonlinear fluctuating growth?
By using 3 distinct mathematical timelines. Or you can think of them as clocks. The most immediate of these is the current annual increment, or CAI.
CAI, got it.
This is the growth achieved in one specific year. The formula is literally just the volume of the tree this year minus the volume of the tree last year.
So CAI is basically a snapshot, but that snapshot must be like highly volatile.
Oh, incredibly volatile.
Because massive rainy year means a huge CAI, but a severe drought year means a tiny one. It's kind of like checking your annual bank interest. It tells you exactly what you earned this year and only this year.
That's a great analogy. And if you map that volatility over the life of a tree, you see a very distinct biological curve.
What does the curve look like?
Well, when trees are young, the CAI rockets upward. They're going through a massive growth spurt. It reaches a sharp peak, and then as the tree matures and ages, that current annual increment gradually declines.
That's slowing down.
The tree is still growing, yes, but the amount of new wood it adds each year gets smaller and smaller.
Which brings us to the second clock. The mean annual increment, or MAI. This is the long view, right?
Yes. MAI is the average yearly growth from the time the tree was planted all the way up to its current age. You just take the total accumulated volume and divide it by the age of the tree.
Okay, so it smooths out the data.
Exactly. It smooths out all those yearly spikes and dips, the great rain years and the terrible droughts. It just tells you, on average, how much this tree has grown every single year of its entire life.
It's essentially an athlete's career stats. The CAI is how many points they scored this season, and the MAI is their career points per game average.
That is the perfect analogy. And just like an athlete, a tree's current season greatly impacts its career average.
Right. So if a rookie comes into the league and scores crazy points their first few seasons, their current performance is actively pulling their lifetime average upward.
Yes, exactly. And eventually, that athlete ages. Their current season performance drops.
The CAI goes down.
Right. And when they start scoring fewer points per season than their career average, they start dragging that lifetime average down.
Okay, I love that concept, and I want to dive really deep into how those two numbers interact in a second. But before we do, there's a third metric we need to address, PAI.
Periodic annual increment.
Right. And this is defined as the average annual growth over a defined period, like 5 or 10 years. You find the total growth over that specific period and divide it by the number of years. But I actually have to push back on this one.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, if we have the current year's data, the CAI, and we have the lifetime average, the MAI isn't a random 5-year chunk just muddying the water.
What do you mean?
By averaging a 10-year span, aren't you masking critical year-to-year data? Like if you had a catastrophic drought 2 years ago, but you smooth it out over a decade, you completely hide the immediate biological stress the forest just endured.
You are absolutely masking granular data. From a pure theoretical data perspective, it's a sacrifice. But you really have to connect this to the reality of logistics.
Logistics?
Yeah. Measuring the current annual increment of 100,000 trees every single year is an administrative and financial impossibility.
Oh, yeah, I guess you'd need an army of surveyors out in the woods with tape measures every January 1st.
It would literally bankrupt any forestry operation.
Yeah.
So PAI offers a highly realistic middle ground. Forest planners usually work in 5 or 10-year management cycles.
Okay, that makes sense.
They survey the forest, log the volume, wait 10 years, survey it again, and just divide that total growth by 10. It captures the current momentum and trajectory of the forest without the impossible labor costs of finding the exact CAI every 365 days.
Okay, so practicality wins out over theoretical perfection. That's fair. But let's go back to that athlete analogy, because here's where it gets really interesting.
Wait, intersection.
Yes. You have your current season performance, the CAI, and you have your lifetime average, the MAI. You map both of those out on a graph over the life of a forest. Eventually, those two lines are going to intersect.
And that intersection is the holy grail of forest management. It is known as the optimal point. And understanding the mechanics of why that point is so crucial, well, it changes everything about how we view natural resources.
Walk me through the mechanics of that crossing point. Why is that specific second in a tree's life so important?
Think about the 3 stages of the life cycle. Stage 1, the trees are young. The CAI, the current growth, is massive. It's significantly higher than the MAI.
Right. The annual growth is actively pulling the lifetime average up. The forest is in this really aggressive expansion phase.
The athlete is in their physical prime, elevating their career stats.
Yeah.
Now skip to stage 3. Old trees. The dynamic is totally flipped. The tree is slowing down. The CAI is now less than the MAI.
The amount of new wood it adds this year is smaller than its lifetime average.
Yes. So that sluggish annual growth is actively dragging the lifetime average down. The asset is depreciating in its efficiency.
So right in between those two phases, the exact moment the CAI line drops down and touches the rising MAI line, that's the optimal point.
Yes. When the current annual increment perfectly equals the mean annual increment, the lifetime average is at its absolute mathematical maximum peak.
Wow.
It will never be higher than it is at that exact moment, because the very next year, The CAI will drop below the MAI and start pulling it down.
So if you're managing a forest for timber, that intersection is the mathematically perfect time to harvest. It's like selling a stock at the exact second its lifetime average catches up to its current momentum. Perfect efficiency.
It's the moment the forest achieves peak rotational value. If you cut the trees before that point, you're leaving money on the table because you're missing out on their fastest, most efficient growth years.
And if you cut them after that point.
If you wait, you're just wasting time and land. The trees are still growing, yes, but they're doing so inefficiently. They're occupying valuable soil and sunlight while actively dragging down their own lifetime average.
So you cut your losses.
Exactly. You'd be better off harvesting, clearing the land, and planting a new generation of saplings that will immediately start rocketing up the CAI curve.
It really is Wall Street efficiency applied to biology. You're capturing the absolute maximum yield of the asset.
Very much so.
But this brings up a crucial nuance. Math is perfect on a whiteboard. You draw the curves, they intersect beautifully, you harvest. But trees grow in the dirt. They grow in the unpredictable real world.
Right.
So what actually moves these numbers up and down out in the wild? Can human beings actually, hack this increment, or are we entirely at the mercy of sunlight and rainfall?
There are several critical variables that dictate increment, and they fall into a nature versus nurture framework. On the nature side, age is the obvious one we just discussed. But there's also species.
Okay, species.
Yeah, some species are genetically predisposed to be fast-growing pioneers, while others are slow-growing climax species.
Right, so a pine tree is going to hit its optimal point decades before a dense oak tree will.
Exactly. Then there's site quality. This encompasses the soil fertility, the ground moisture, and the available sunlight of the specific physical location. And scaling up from that is climate, the broader regional patterns of rainfall and temperature.
But then we get to the nurture side, or really the human intervention side, because foresters don't just plant trees and walk away for 40 years, they use silviculture.
They do, and actively doing so is the entire profession of silviculture. Through strategic interventions like thinning, pruning, and fertilization, foresters artificially reshape those mathematical curves.
Let's talk about thinning, because this feels so counterintuitive to me.
Oh, it does at first, yeah.
If your goal is to maximize the volume of wood on 100 acres, how does going in and cutting down a large percentage of your trees early actually boost the final volume? Haven't you just destroyed half your inventory?
You lose immediate volume, yes, but you radically alter the site quality for the survivors. This goes back to our earlier discussion on basal area and density.
The crowded room.
Right. A specific acre of land has a hard cap on resources. There's only so much water in the soil, only so many nutrients, and only a finite canopy space for sunlight.
The room is at capacity.
If you have 1,000 trees fighting for those capped resources, they are all in a state of severe competition. Their individual CAI is going to be incredibly stunted.
Because they're starving.
Yeah, they'll hit their optimal point prematurely because they simply don't have the fuel to sustain rapid growth.
So you go in and cut down the weakest 500 trees.
You thin the stand. Suddenly, the remaining 500 trees have double the water, double the nutrients, and zero neighbors shading out their sunlight. Their current annual increment absolutely skyrockets in response.
Wow. You've artificially manipulated the environment so that the remaining trees get a massive slice of the pie.
You effectively push that optimal point further into the future, but at a much higher total volume. And pruning works similarly.
Cutting off the lower branches.
Exactly. By removing lower branches, you force the tree's biological energy away from horizontal spread and direct it entirely into vertical growth and thickening the central trunk. You're literally shaping where the increment goes.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've talked about optimal points, board feet, and harvest efficiency. But this goes way beyond logging and lumber yards, doesn't it?
It does.
Measuring increment has massive global implications right now.
Oh, absolutely. While increment is crucial for yield estimation and long-term timber planning, it's also how we monitor overall ecosystem health. A sudden, unexplained drop in a forest's periodic annual increment is a massive red flag.
Like a warning light on a dashboard.
Exactly like that. Long before a forest starts physically dying, a drop in PAI tells scientists that something is deeply wrong. Perhaps a subtle shift in the water table, an invasive pest, or a fungal disease.
It allows for intervention before the damage is irreversible.
Right. But there's an even more urgent application for this math today. Increment is the exact science used in carbon stock assessments.
And this connects directly to modern environmentalism and the global economy.
It does. This is where biomass becomes critical again. When a tree increases its biomass, when its CAI is high, it is physically pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it into its cellular structure.
Okay, so if a country or a massive corporation claims they're offsetting 1 million tons of carbon emissions, they can't just point to a map and say, look, we planted 1 million trees.
No.
That doesn't actually mean anything mathematically.
Planting the trees is just the start. To prove their carbon offset, they have to know the precise increment. They have to know exactly where those trees are on their CAI curve.
Because if it's a young, vigorously growing forest with a skyrocketing CAI, it is actively sucking down massive amounts of carbon every single year. It's an aggressive carbon sink.
But if it's a late-stage, old-growth forest where the CAI has dropped well below the MAI, the dynamic changes.
How so?
That forest holds a massive amount of stored carbon, which is vital to protect, obviously. But its rate of new sequestration has slowed to a crawl. The yearly increment is tiny.
Wow. So if a nation bases its international climate treaty promises on the assumption that their old-growth forests are absorbing vast amounts of new carbon every year, but the math proves their CAI has cratered.
Their entire emission strategy is built on faulty math,
That is wild.
which is why understanding increment is the absolute foundation of sustainable forest management. You cannot manage what you cannot measure.
That's the bottom line.
Whether your objective is maximizing profit for a lumber company, preserving biodiversity, or balancing a global carbon budget, the mathematical reality of how the forest grows dictates every single decision you make.
It's incredible. We started by looking at the physical dimensions, measuring density with basal area, and dividing goals between volume and biomass.
Right.
And we tracked those dimensions through the 3 clocks of the forest, the immediate volatility of the CAI, the smoothed out lifetime average of the MAI, and the practical logistical compromise of the PAI.
The whole picture.
We found that golden intersection where the current momentum perfectly meets the lifetime average to signal the peak rotational harvest. And we saw how human beings use silviculture to actively hack those variables to guide the math in our favor.
It completely transforms the way you perceive a landscape, doesn't it?
It really does.
But, if we consider the broader implications of these formulas, there's a final, rather provocative thought we have to consider.
Oh.
We noted earlier that climate, regional rainfall, and temperature is a foundational variable driving a forest's increment.
Right. The climate is basically the engine dictating how fast these curves move.
But what happens when that engine fundamentally changes? We base our mean annual increment, these massive lifetime averages, on historical data. We look back at 100 years of growth to establish the curve.
Yeah.
But if global temperatures and rainfall patterns permanently shift in the coming decades, what happens to the math?
Wait, wow. Because the denominator of that MAI equation lived in a climate that just doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly. Will the historical MAI of our ancient forests become completely obsolete? Will the data we've gathered over the last century lose its predictive power?
The current annual increment of tomorrow is going to be reacting to a totally different world than the lifetime average of yesterday.
Which means foresters and climate scientists might have to throw out decades of established mathematical models and completely redefine the optimal point for the forests of the future.
That is a staggering thought to leave on. It really highlights how delicate and responsive these long-term biological equations actually are.
Very delicate.
The next time you take a walk through your neighborhood or go for a hike in the woods, I encourage you to look at the trees around you a little differently. Don't just see them as static pillars of wood standing quietly in the dirt. Look at them as living, breathing equations. Think about that invisible race happening inside every single trunk as its current momentum chases its lifetime average. The forest isn't frozen in time at all, it's calculating.